These are 33 of Valheim's most underrated items, at least underrated by me. Feel free to call me a fool in the comments for sleeping on your favorite item. Starting off, I cheated a little bit with the rested buff. While not being an item, when I first played Valheim, I criminally underrated always having this active. Not only does it increase your stamina and health regeneration, but also gives you a nice buff to your XP gain. Valheim is literally unplayable without it. Next are Bile and Ooze Bombs, which for whatever reason I never crafted until my third playthrough. These things are fantastic at dealing with large groups of enemies when in a pinch, and especially the Ooze Bombs, as they deal damage through walls, making them excellent for clearing infested mines and any dungeon for that matter. The first weapon on this list is the class of Spears, which is a controversial weapon type and one I swore off using for years. Nowadays, I can't put them down. Their ability to function both as ranged and melee weapons combined with their quick attack speed and faster experience gain compared to other melee weapon classes truly sets them apart. The Root Mask is a great helmet, providing poison resistance, and also makes this list because I believe it gets overlooked by the poison resistance mead. Yes, the mead provides more resistance than the mask, but the mask effect never expires and looks super cool. Thrones are clearly the best furniture pieces in the game, for they give more comfort than any other, being the only type to give 3. Remember the rested buff we discussed earlier? Adding comfort to your rested area will increase the duration of the buff, and no furniture does it better than Thrones. The Porcupine comes in at number 28 as it is almost always overshadowed by the Frostner, and I think unfairly so. This weapon stands out as one of the few to do multiple types of physical damage in both blunt and pierce, allowing you flexibility in navigating the variable resistance of creatures you will face. I still lean Frostner as the better overall weapon, but this is an excellent alternative, and not to mention, it looks awesome. Maybe the only buff in the game that's better than the rested buff is the Corpse Run effect. Unfortunately, to get this one, you will need to, well, die. While it does have a short duration following interaction with a tombstone, its benefits are unmatched. In fact, if you're comfortable sacrificing your valuable skill experience, you can use the command /die to spam the creation of these tombstones to repeatedly grab the buff. This strategy is often used by speedrunners to defeat Bowmass, or alternatively, can be used to search the freezing mountains without frost resistance, as the healing provided by the buff outweighs the freezing damage, plus gives you dramatic stamina usage reduction. The next one is a bit of a joke, but can we please give a quick round of applause to the Workbench and Hammer? This pair are the foundation for crafting and building in Valheim, and I don't think we show them the appreciation they deserve. Admittedly, I'm not much of a builder, but when I do, I need to gather a ton of tar. Tar is required for the iconic Darkwood build pieces, which I consider to be the most aesthetically pleasing of any Valheim's builds. Honey is the foundation for many of the game's greatest foods and meads, and is therefore critical for mid and late game progression. If you aren't prioritizing starting a honey farm in the early game, you should be. Of all Valheim's arrows, I think the needle stands out the most and deserve more praise. Unlike every other arrow in the game, these do not require wood to craft. Better yet too, they only require a workbench, unlike the higher damage dealing carapace and charred arrows. The Serpent Shield is one of, if not the most unlikely shield for me to craft on any given playthrough for 2 reasons. 1, I'm not a huge fan of tower shields, and 2, it requires serpent scales, one of the more elusive and difficult resources to gather in the game. That said, the pierce resistance provided by the shield is unique and very powerful. Concerning how strong pierce resistance is with the harness, perhaps I'm sleeping on this item as well. Of all Valheim's ships, the Carve I think is the most slept on, as most people accelerate towards building the Viking ship for its increased speed and carrying capacity. However, in many ways, I think the Carve is the best ship going. For 1, it can turn on a dime unlike the larger Viking, and 2, it can more easily navigate narrow passages unlike the big bootied Viking. And don't get me started on the Drakkar's fat. Campfires like the Workbench and Hammer are probably obvious, but these guys deserve more serious praise. Not only do they provide the fire status required for the rested buff, but they can also keep the Meadows creatures at bay in the early game and service as an extremely underrated weapon. I have recently adopted using it to fight Greydwarf, skeletons, and even bosses like Eikthyr and the Elder in my live streams as of late. If you haven't checked us out, we stream every Wednesday and Sunday, so make sure you give us a follow over on Twitch so you don't miss a thing. This one is probably just me, and you guys can laugh at me if you wish, but I never use health and stamina meats hardly ever. Resistance meads, yes. Tonic of Ratatosk, hell yes. But for whatever reason, I never take the time to craft health and stamina, and I really should. Health can be the difference between life and death after taking a few hits, and who does not want faster stamina regeneration? We all know the shield generator is great for the Ashlands, protecting you from the falling flame, but where it's underrated is in the swamp. Long have I wanted something to protect me from the constant wet debuff, and this device finally does. Place it down, power it with bones, and never get damp again. If only this also worked in the mountains to protect us from the cold and allow crops to grow. Fader's trophy, or rather his power, is the first of 2 Forsaken powers to make my underrated list. I, for one, am bad for brute force carrying heavy materials and making many manual trips with what I can carry on my person, but in reality, I should really be grabbing this power to assist in moving materials more quickly. I slept on the Silver Sword for a long time, and honestly, fairly for a while, with spirit damage being underwhelming until recently. This has since changed with the release of the Ashlands with so many undead foes. Assuming a creature you are fighting doesn't have a resistance to spirit, this weapon is mega powerful. The tanker gets all the love for having a pint with your Viking buddies, but where is my Horn of Celebration love? Nothing beats having a quick swig of mead with your pals with this cup, added to Valheim to celebrate the game's first anniversary back in 2022, and looks so much better. The Staff of Frost often gets overshadowed by its flashier cousin in the Staff of Embers, but in many ways has grown to become my staff of choice even in the Ashlands. Yes, it has shorter range and doesn't have the AoE effect that Embers has, but the freezing effect cannot be ignored. Considering the massive amount of enemies that will be swarming you amongst the ash, the freezing provided by this lends a huge helping hand. Admittedly, I almost never buy the Devagar Circlet from Haldor, and shame on me, because since I posted my 30 most useless items in Valheim video, I've got a ton of comments defending this item, and boy were they right. This thing makes a world of difference whether I'm marching around my base after dark, or better yet, exploring burial chambers or sunken crypts. The troll set, I feel, is often overshadowed by the bronze armor simply because it provides less damage resistance, but for me, it's by far the best in the Black Forest. It doesn't reduce your movement speed, provides a sneaky set bonus, and best yet, doesn't require you to grind bronze for its crafting. Oh, and it's sexy as hell too. The game's most underrated fashion item is the linen cape. Certainly not for function, as weirdly, unlike almost all capes following the wolf, doesn't provide frost resistance. However, it is the only cape that allows you to craft it in multiple colors, making for easily the most stylish the game has to offer. Maybe one day the Valheim devs can add a loom or dyes to give us more customization of the crafting of our gear. Which color is your favorite? Like Fader's power, I slept on the Troll Endurance Mead since its addition in the Bogwitch update. While it doesn't provide quite as much carrying capacity as the power, it's much more accessible and can be used continuously should you have sufficient materials to craft several. Or better yet, combine it with the power for major weight carrying capacity. While previously on my list of most useless items in Valheim, coins are making a big comeback, having use cases beside purchases from Haldor and decorations. With the release of the Bogwitch update, we now have an awesome gold sink with valuable feasts and mead ingredients ready for purchase. The second staff on this list is the Staff of Protection, which may not actually be underrated, but I had to include it because if you're sleeping on this, you must wake up right now. No, it doesn't do any damage, but my god, I think it's the best staff in the game. At base blood magic level, your bubble can absorb 200 damage, which can be increased as high as 700 by leveling its skill to max, also reducing the stamina and health used to cast. You can use this staff with a melee build as long as you have one item providing food. In fact, a melee build with a pocket Staff of Protection may just be the most powerful combat strategy in Valheim. We all know the harpoon is primarily used for dragging serpents to shore, but if you're not using it for these two other functions, you're likely underrating it as a tool. For one, you can use it to pull creatures into pens for taming, and after being tamed, you can enable friendly fire to drag them around. 2, rather than spend your precious arrows hunting birds for feathers, use the harpoon, completely free to use. The bonfire, like the campfire, is a great weapon, but in my opinion, more underrated than its tinier cousin. This does significantly more damage and can be used to deal with larger creatures with limited gear. Place it on the ground, lure an enemy nearby, and place a log inside to set the creature ablaze. Bait the creature to turn or navigate into it, taking continuous damage, all the while repairing the bonfire. This works wonders against Abomination, Wraith, locks, and even Seeker and Seeker soldiers. The hoe is easily the most underrated defensive tool in Valheim. Rather than only terraforming for the purpose of base building, you can raise earth to create impenetrable walls, or below your feet for a quick height advantage when in a pinch. This works handily when raided, especially by wolves. Of all Valheim bows, I think the Huntsman is the most underrated, which makes sense considering its best attribute is hidden from its description. All bows have a hidden hit noise stat that alerts nearby enemies when an arrow is released and lands. Unlike all others, the Huntsman bow is a measly 4 meters, making this the stealthiest bow in the game. Both Jotunbane and Berserkir axes are underrated, but not the way you might think. Yes, they can be great weapons in combat, especially the Berserkir, but you have to remember they can still be used to chop trees. Silly me always thought of them as weapons and considered the black metal axe as the best for woodcutting, but not the case, as Jotunbane and Berserkir do significantly more chop damage. Our runner-up is the battering ram, often slept on because its main purpose is not that useful, with so many simpler strategies for gaining entrance to fortresses. Surprisingly, it also serves as the best resource gathering tool in the whole game. Use it to destroy giant stone columns in the plains, or metal nodes like copper in the Black Forest, or any other resource node for the fastest resource gathering strategy in Valheim. Number 1 is the first Forsaken power in Eikthyr. Its excellence is common knowledge, but despite this, I still think it is overshadowed by bone mass. After all, if you're not getting hit, bone mass isn't really required. The reduced stamina consumption granted by Ike allows you to sprint further and longer, helping you avoid being hit altogether. Not to mention, it's simply great for traveling long distances a little faster, and if you thought this video was controversial, I think this one will have it beat.